Okay, Warlocks, let's do this thing right. TBC is coming up. We're going to be one of the best classes. It's time to arm you with the knowledge that I know. I've been playing Warlocks for about 10 years on private servers and now on Classic, and I'm ready to move into TBC and just rock the meters. So we'll cover the basics. We'll cover some tips and tricks and some of the things that I've incorporated in my gameplay that make me a cut above the rest of the Warlocks in the game. So follow along and let's own this thing. First, I want to take a quick pit stop at the leveling process, going from 60 to 70 with TBC Classic. If you're one of those newly boosted Warlocks, maybe a warrior refugee going to the new best class in TBC, well, the spec you really want to go if you're under-geared is the Felguard spec. Deep in the demonology tree, you get that 41 point talent of Felguard, and basically you can spend your other points wherever you want because Felguard is going to carry you to 70. But if you are geared, you have a couple options in front of you. You have the Unstable Affliction spec, and you have the Deep Destruction spec. With Unstable Affliction, what you're really trying to do is you just put up your 3 dots. UA, Corruption, and Agony or Immolate, depending on how you pull. And you put up those 3 dots, and things will just die. You put up the 3 dots, you move to the next mob, you put up 3 dots, you move to the next one. You can kind of do this endlessly, especially at the early levels if you're leveling out into the world. This even works in groups as well, although it's not as strong as the Destruction Tree for group play and dungeon cleaves and those kind of things. If you are doing dungeon cleaves, I would recommend the Destruction spec. Deep into the Destruction Tree at the 41 point talent, you get Shadow Fury, and there's a ton of other really good talents all through the Destruction Tree, especially Ruin, Shadow Burn, a number of other spells. So, you know, really these are your options there in front of you. Personally, myself, I'm going to be doing a dungeon cleave. I'm going deep in the Destruction Tree. I've been playing with Shadow Fury a lot in the pre-patch, especially in PvP, and it just destroys. So I would really recommend that. If you're geared, you have that max gear in front of you, go to Deep Destruction Tree and dungeon cleaves or UA out in the world, and let me know how it works out for you. I will note, if you're going the route of soloing slave pens, if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to put a link down below to Crix Gaming's channel. He kind of came up with this idea of slave pen solo farming. This is really efficient way to level, but it's going to be very boring. So if you choose to do this, this is a solo killing of mobs and slave pens that does not rely on any terrain gimmicks whatsoever. It just relies basically on kiting with Curse of Exhaustion. I tested level 62 to 63 on there. It took me about an hour and a half to get 62 to 63, which is about 2 to 3 times faster than doing quests in Zangarmarsh. So just keep that in mind if you're a Warlock and you don't have a dungeon cleave group, that this is an option in front of you, especially if you're geared. As we look at the Warlock rating specs for TBC, we're again down to 2 options. We have the Unstable Affliction and the Deep Affliction spec, or the Deep Destruction spec for the maximum pumpers. Affliction spec is really more of a utility spec. It brings 2 main purposes to a raid. One, you have the Shadow's Embrace talent, which reduces the amount of damage that mobs do when they have this debuff on them by 5%. That's really important. It lowers that overall damage that the raid is going to take, especially important for melee and TBC. And the second is adding to the Curse of Elements, the Malediction talent here at the bottom, which increases the amount of caster damage by 3% on mobs that have this debuff on it. Those are 2 really important utility things that boost everybody's ability in TBC. Now, the reason why this spec, you only have 1 of them and it's not the Deep Pumper spec, is that honestly, Unstable Affliction is one of the hardest specs to play in order to keep up with DPS because it's a dot spec. You're juggling all these dot timers the entire time. It also actually, unfortunately, is one of the more fun specs, even though it's undertuned. So it's unfortunate that it just isn't as strong. And the other reason it doesn't have Ruin. That's the big kicker for Warlocks getting the big pumps out, is that your crits are just more damage when you have that talent, and you don't have that available as Unstable Affliction. So this is your raid utility Warlock talent. You want 1 of these in every single raid. It can be a lot of fun, and in multi-target fights, it does do really well. So you want to look at that as one of your Warlock talents. The next spec is the Big Pumper Warlock spec. It's Demonic Sacrifice and Deep Destruction put together. There's 2 variants of this. You can go to Shadow version, you can go to Fire version. Eventually Shadow will end up being probably what most people use, but if you have mages still in your raid and they're going Fire and they have that extra, you can use Incinerate instead of Shadow Bolt in this talent tree build, and you'll do really, really well. So these are the two trees here, 0, 21, 40. This is the spec that I'm gonna go, and this is your classic keep pumping the shadow bolts out. If you do end up doing the fire variant and you have fire mages, even if you're doing the shadow variant, if you have fire mages in your raid and they're giving you that fire vulnerability debuff that increases fire damage taken by mobs that are debuffed by it, you want to open with Immolate here and then do your assigned curse of elements if you don't have an affliction warlock, or it's curse of recklessness, or the big damage dealing curse, which is curse of doom. If the mob's going to live for a minute, Curse of Doom is actually the highest single GCD we can spend on a single fight. So you want to put out those Curse of Dooms as much as possible. But you do your curse, you do Immolate, and then you Shadow Bolt fill until the Immolate dot falls off, and then you Immolate. If you don't have any fire mages in your group, it's just Curse, Shadow Bolt, Curse, Shadow Bolt, or Curse, Incinerate. But if you're Incinerate, you really want to make sure you have fire mages, otherwise you're losing basically 50% damage. A few of you might ask here, you know, Nano, what about Felguard? Isn't Felguard cool? Felguard's really cool. Why can't I do Felguard? Well, honestly, Felguard is fun, and maybe at the first bit of the expansion you can go Felguard, but the honest answer is it just doesn't scale. If you want to go Felguard, that's great. Do that. Just know you're not going to top the meters, and this rest of this video is probably not for you. So again, we're looking at those two specs, Unsable Affliction and Destruction, and that's where we're going to kind of land. All right, the next section here, we're going to talk about professions. It's pretty talked about a lot. Every Warlock guide will talk about professions, but I will hit on it here. Tailoring is an absolute must for Warlocks because of the two different tailoring sets, the Shadow Weave set, or Spell Strike if you end up going, or Spell Fire, I should say, if you end up going Fire, and the Spell Strike set, regardless if you're Fire or not. The Shadow Weave requires tailoring, and the Spell Strike set requires tailoring for the set bonus. These are huge and part of every best in slot list you'll see for phase 4. This is really a must. You have to have tailoring if you want to get the most out of your Warlock DPS. Your second profession is still a subject that's up for debate. After the leatherworking nerf to drums, it's still wondering like what is actually the best second profession to take. People talk about enchanting, jewel crafting, leatherworking still, or going with engineering. Personally, I'm going to go with engineering at the start of phase 4 because if you're willing to spend the money, I'm pretty sure throwing grenades or throwables, grenades, dynamite, whatever it is, or using sappers is going to be more damage than the ring enchants or the jewel craft specific gems will give you in terms of their raw damage output. If you don't want to spend the money on the engineering stuff, then yeah, you might want to end up taking the enchanting, leveling enchanting up, enchanting your rings. I think that's better than jewel crafting, although jewel crafting probably will have more options for gold making. So if you're only playing one character, that's another thing to consider as well, that maybe I want to take jewel crafting, try to get lucky on the rare patterns, and flip gems all through the expansion to make money. If you don't have a leatherworker in your group, then this is also a consideration, although leatherworking for a Warlock is basically, I'm just going to use drums. I want to always use drums, which if that's you, that's great. But I'm going to hopefully be relying on either a elemental shaman or a boomkin in my group that will be that leatherworker because they get ulterior benefits to it other than just using drums. So that's kind of where I'm landing with professions for Warlocks for TBC. For me, I am currently in classic tailoring and engineering. I'm going to stick with that through phase 4. And if anything changes and reevaluates along the way, then I'll choose what the next best option is. But engineering brings just a whole lot of benefits and, you know, honestly is more fun than the other professions, and that's where I'm going. So this is when we're going to dive in a little bit more into how to min-max your Warlock. And this is also where I start to deviate a little bit from the other specs and guides and spreadsheets that you'll see out there about how to maximize Warlock DPS. We're talking about ideal group composition in 25 mans. TBC raid composition is all about group and raid buffs, enabling the hybrid classes to have almost must-have buffs and debuffs to bring value to the raid. And there's 3 main support classes for Warlocks that are looking to be in their group together, and that's Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, and Boomkin. Most guides that you'll look at will talk about Elemental Shaman and Boomkin, especially when you look at spreadsheets. They're going to kind of prioritize Elemental Shaman and Boomkin, and they are really, really good. For me personally, after testing it a little bit, Shadow Priest for me is the most important class to have in my group, especially early on when our mana pools are very low, our int levels are low, and we're going more frequently. The mana battery sustain from Vampiric Touch helps sustain our DPS significantly. Every single GCD that we save not having the life tap is a massive DPS boost, and those Shadow Priests really feed us so much more mana that I'm casting 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 more Shadow Bolts than the Warlock next to me, just because I don't have to life tap in a long fight. That is super important and should not be discounted whatsoever, especially with long fights like Magtheridon in Phase 4. This is a must-have for me in my group. The Shadow Priest mana battery is uber important. The next one I'm looking at is Elemental Shaman. That's the second most important to me, and that's due to 2 things. Their Totem of Wrath and Totem of Air just bring so much value. The Totem of Wrath, personally, it's one of the biggest buffs in the entire expansion. It gives 3% spell hit and 3% spell crit. Hit, especially in the early part of the expansion, is harder to come by, and that's super important. And it also has the Totem of Air that just gives me a flat extra 100 spell damage. All of those are just really strong and help, push us to the next level. The third one is the Boomkins. The Moonkin Aura gives an extra 5% crit chance. It's good. It's really good. And especially when they get the idol that bumps it up even more, it is really strong and does compete with Elemental Shaman. Those are close in my mind. But ultimately, I think it gets outpaced by the Shadow Priest and the LA Shaman, especially in Phase 4 when hit is harder to come by. That Elemental Shaman, Totem of Wrath, and the mana battery from the Shadow Priest outpace Boomkins for me, but I'm willing to be convinced that I'm wrong. But after testing it myself, that's where I'm landing. Currently in my raid, we're planning to have a Warlock group with 3 Warlocks, a Shadow Priest, and an Elemental Shaman. We will have a Boomkin in the raid for that improved Fairy Fire for everybody. Most likely we'll be in a group with some of the mages, then the leftover healers in group 5. Alright, stat weights and gear. I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time here. Some of you might think I will spend a lot of time in this section, but I won't, because I think this is the conversation that ends up being talked about way too much, and it's somehow also simplified in the way that everybody talks about it. So people will tell you, if you ask about spell weights and what should I be looking for first, and you want to talk about spell hit, which is better than spell damage, which is better than crit, which is better than haste. And that's generally correct, except for a few things. If you hit your spell hit cap, yeah, spell hit doesn't mean anything for you anymore. You don't care about it. When you're talking about haste basically doesn't matter at all until it matters a lot. So, for example, if my normal Shadow Bolt cast is 2.5 seconds and I get enough haste to lower it to 2.4, there's only very specific scenarios where that difference in the spell cast actually adds an extra Shadow Bolt cast in the course of the fight. And if you're not at that point, then spell haste does not matter at all to increasing your DPS. You're still casting the same amount of Shadow Bolts. So you want to have these conversations in line. If you do hit some spell break points in terms of haste, then that becomes better than almost anything except for getting hit capped, because you can just pump out more Shadow Bolts. And then based on what I talked about with Shadow Priests, that is a massive DPS increase. Okay, that's step 1 of this. The second step that nobody talks about is that all these things don't exist in a vacuum. If you're comparing hit rating versus crit rating, well, if it's 4 spell hit and it's 12 spell crit, even though I want hit more than crit, the much more value that I get from crit, the 8 difference there, it makes up for the fact that crit is worse than hit. And really, this is something that you have to look at a spreadsheet for. And I'll put 2 options down below. In the link below, there's 2 options to jpaint's and Zephan's Warlocks spreadsheets and their simulators from the Warlock Discord. They do an incredible job. They've built these incredible spreadsheets. You should use them. You enter in your own gear, the current gear that you're using, and you can see your output, your ideal output for, all your damage. This is basically a raid bots for TBC Warlocks. And then you can really compare, okay, what does spell hit give me? What does spell crit give me? What does spell haste give me? And how much spell damage equivalents are all of these? And that's how you compare upgrades to each other. That's the way that you really should be doing it, not looking at this vacuum of hit versus damage versus crit versus haste. This is a really important thing. I talked about this all the time in Classic, and I still saw Warlocks running around, especially early on, with the Star of Mysteria neck instead of the Choker of Enlightenment or the you know, the Dark Moon Fair neck, which was significantly better. They were running around with the Star of Mysteria neck with no world buffs, no consumables, thinking that it's better because, you know, Warlocks can't hit. They need hit. They got it in their brain that they needed the max spell hit, and they were nerfing themselves in the process. Don't let that happen to you in TBC. Don't be fooled into thinking every spell hit's better than everything else, because that's not true. You want to look at these comparisons, get these spreadsheets, and really min-max your own gearing process so you can maximize your DPS, and that's really what we're all about. Alright, tips and tricks to how to maximize your damage and get the most out of your Warlock in TBC. So number one, you need to know the fights in and out. If you want to maximize and be the best Warlock you can be, you can no longer rely on your raid leader to call out all the mechanics that are going to happen in the fight. You need to know what they're happening ahead of time and know how you're reacting ahead of time to get all the damage done. I'm going to look at one example from Classic, and that's Instructor Resuvius. There is one mechanic in this fight for casters that they really need to care about, and that's the Disrupting Shout. Every so often, Resuvius will do a Disrupting Shout and clear all of the mana users. He'll do damage equal to the amount of mana that people have available to them when they get hit by Disrupting Shout. But you can avoid this by moving out of line of sight. So, as a Warlock, I know this mechanic, and I know the timing of it, and in Deadly Boss mods, the first Disrupting Shouts for Classic always happens about 1 to 2 seconds after the timer lands in DBM. I know this because I've paid attention. And so I know in that first Disrupting Shout, I can stay in a tick longer than everyone else behind me who has gotten out and only following DBM. I can get an extra, sometimes an extra cast of a Shadow Bolt out before I have to get out of line of sight to avoid the Disrupting Shout. I also know that Disrupting Shout does not hit players who are immune to physical damage because the Shout itself does physical damage. And so I could do two things in Classic. I could get a Blessing of Protection from a Paladin during that Disrupting Shout so I can continue casting uninterrupted, or I can use a Limited Invulnerability Potion in Classic, which also immunes me to physical damage. Those two things allow me to completely ignore the Disrupting Shout mechanic and stay in and cast more Shadow Bolts. I am doing more damage because I have more uptime on the boss than everybody else. Because I know how the fight mechanic works, I can do more damage than other people. And that's just simple fact. Moving into TBC, that's going to be true as well. If you know exactly where you need to be for Magtheridon to press your key and to get back into the fight, you're going to do more damage than somebody that doesn't know where they're supposed to go and what they're doing. It sounds obvious, but people don't do this. I've been playing Classic Warlock for 10 years. I play with a lot of Warlocks, and I've outpaced all of them on damage for essentially my last 10 years. There's been a few exceptions of people who do just as much damage as me. They're great players, but there's people who don't. And the big reason why, and they ask me, how are you doing more damage, is I look at the logs. Our average Shadow Bolt damage is essentially the same, but I cast 3, 4, 5, 6 more Shadow Bolts than you on this fight because I know the mechanics and you're just spending your time running around. Even though you're a good player in a good guild, you're still losing damage when you move around. And that's tip number one. Know the fight, know when to stand still, and get as much uptime damage on the boss as possible. Tip number two is when you have to move, know what you're going to do ahead of time while you're moving. There are certain abilities that Warlocks can use that are instant cast spells that will give you damage. If you're expecting to improve Corruption, do Corruption. If you have a curse you can reapply because the timer's coming out, then you use the curse while you're moving. Shadow Burn, Death Coil, whatever it is, whatever instant cast spell that you have, use it while you're moving and only while you're moving if you can help it. So those fights with a lot of movement, you need to prepare ahead of time. Okay, I know I'm moving in 10 seconds. I know my Corruption timing is coming up. I know my Shadow Burn is going to come up off a cooldown. I want to save it to make sure I have it for that move phase because otherwise I will be doing nothing. That time, the uptime again, just what we talked about in tip one, is really important to maximize while you have to move. And that will enable you to step up above the other casters who aren't utilizing these tricks. Mages should be using Fire Blast when they're moving. You know, Hunters should be using Arcane Shot while they're moving if they have it up. They should plan for it ahead of time. These kind of things are really important to figure out how to maximize your damage, and it will set you apart from other Warlocks. And the third one, it's not really a tip or trick, but honestly, it's be prepared, right? Come with your consumables, know what you need, have more than you'll possibly use in a raid. Bring your mana potions, bring your demonic or dark runes so you're prepared to use everything that you have. There's so many things in this game that you can use to enable yourself to do more than other people around you, and if you don't use it, well, you're falling behind. I use every consumable that is in front of me because It's there. I can spend the time and go do that. And I care about being set apart from the crowd. I want to do more damage than any other Warlock, any other caster, anybody else in the raid. In TBC, I can do that now because I'm a Warlock and I'm ready to pump. And if I'm up against a Warlock who's just not as prepared as I am, well, I'm going to out damage them because I was ready to go. So that's tip number 3. Be prepared for the raid and come with everything that you can bring. Preach put out a video a little while ago talking about these ideas and how to maximize your damage, and then I incorporated a few of his thoughts from his video in this one for you. I'm going to put his video in the link down below. It is retail oriented. He's talking about a boomkin for the Shadowlands expansion, but the applications, the principles that he's talking about will apply to anybody in World of Warcraft for any class, any DPS spec whatsoever. So if you want to really set yourself apart, follow what Mike has to say here and really follow it to a T, because he has a lot of good that you can learn from, that I learned from as well. The last thing that you can do to really set yourself apart as a Warlock is use your utility spells. Warlocks not only are one of the best top DPS classes in TBC, but we also bring a whole multitude of utility to the raid. We have summoning, we have hellstones, we have curse of tongues. Knowing when to use curse of tongues on trash is really, really important because it lowers that total damage, and it's something that only you can do really, unless you bring rogues with mind numbing poison. But curse of tongues, this is an application that you should use when you can. You have drain mana. It has very rare applications, but when you can use it, it matters a lot. You have fear, you have AoE fear and Howl of Terror, you have banishes, you have enslaved demon, and you even have Eye of Kilrog, which you can use to grab mobs from a distance very safely. I don't see Warlocks who use these spells very well, especially in the PvP environment, which we're not really talking about right now, but using your utility spells that are available to you, which you have multitudes of, is mind-boggling to me. You have one of the most impressive utility toolkits in the entire game, and so many Warlocks don't use them and don't know how to use them. So don't be one of those Warlocks. Be the good one that sets yourself apart from everybody else. Be the Warlock that always puts Curse of Tongues up. Be the Warlock who always knows when to banish and gets the timing of the banish right. Be the Warlock who surprises people when they enslave a really cool demon that does a lot of damage in Karazhan. By the way, get the dogs in the basement because they do just a ton of damage. Enslave the dogs in the basement of Karazhan. Thank me later. Be the Warlock that's the first Warlock to summon people. Everybody loves the Warlock that summons people. Be that guy. Be the Warlock that's dropping the soul wells right away and gets everybody their hellstones that they need, and just go ahead and like, hey, grab your hellstone. I got it for you. Be the Warlock that summons the Eye of Kilrog and pulls things before the Hunter even does, because the Hunter doesn't know what's going on. Be the best Warlock and set yourself apart and use your utility spells well. Alright, last few things to clean it up, right? If you're looking for some gearing tips, you want to look probably to WoWhead. WoWhead's probably a better option for you than coming back to this video and trying to find where the gearing is. You can bookmark this. You can always go back to it while you're leveling. And it's this Warlock guide on WoWhead from Zephan, who's an incredible Warlock, does a lot of work on the Warlock Discord. So you want to go here. He put out 3 different best in slot lists. We're talking about pre-patch best in slot, which we're almost over with, but it's there for you if you want to figure it out in the last week of the pre-patch. You also have the pre-raid best in slot and the phase 1 tier 4 best in slot list. He has that ready for you, and you can bookmark it. You can go back to it. He has loot guides for Karazhan. He has a lot of really good stuff. So I'm not going to go into that because he's done all the work. So go there. Go to Zephan's guide on WoWhead. He's done a great job there. Also, other utility things, join the Warlock Discord. There are a ton of people there who are ready to help new Warlocks and old Warlocks alike who want to step up their game for TBC. And they'll help you. There's spreadsheets, there's guides, there's people to ask questions. There's a ton of PvE and PvP resources. There's macros, there's add-ons, there's weak auras, there's all different kinds of things, and you can find them on the Discord. So I recommend you go there and get plugged in with that community. I don't talk all that much, but I do work, and it is an awesome community of people who are really out there spending a lot of their time, a lot of personal time, trying to help you get better at this game. All right, Warlocks, that's all I got for you. Hopefully you grabbed a couple things in here that were new, that were different, maybe even challenged you a little bit to step up your game as TBC is coming out. I take a lot of pride in being a Warlock. I take a lot of pride in my Warlock team and my guild. I want to push them to be better, and I want to push you to be better as well. We have the opportunity here to be at the top of the meters for basically the entire expansion. So let's take advantage of it. Let's be the best Warlocks we can all be out there. And when in doubt, press Seed of Corruption.